Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. A project that documents Hispanic New Mexican migration from New Mexico to different parts of the United States during the last century is underway, collecting personal stories of people searching for opportunities. We now hear from the people behind the Manito Trail Project to learn more. Joining us is co-director Levi Romero. He is an assistant professor in Chicana and Chicano studies at the University of New Mexico. He is the director of the New Mexico Cultural Studies Certificate Program there. In 2020, he was selected as the first poet laureate in New Mexico. Also joining us is co-director of the project, Dr. Vanessa Fonseca Chavez, an assistant professor of English at Arizona State University Polytechnic. Dr. Fonseca also teaches courses in Chicana and Chicano studies and has recently been named as a recipient of a Whiting Public Engagement Grant to conduct storytelling and preservation workshops in Hispanic communities in rural eastern Arizona. Also joining us is Dr. Trisha Martinez. She is a research project manager with the group. Another scholar working on the program is Dr. Patricia Perea with the UNM Chicana and Chicano Studies Department. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to start off to hear about your personal connections with this project. Vanessa, could you start, please?
Absolutely. So thank you for having us, Anthony. My family is from northwestern New Mexico, and so the Arizona-New Mexico borderlands are really important for me in terms of that Manito migration. A lot of my family historically moved from the Albuquerque-Atrisco area over to northwestern New Mexico near Zuni Pueblo. But I also have family who are from southeastern New Mexico and made their way over to the mining towns of Arizona. And so I actually lived for a little while in Silver City, New Mexico, in Pinos Altos. And so part of what I want to do is look really at that Arizona-New Mexico borderland migration.
Levi, your personal connections with this project and why you feel it's needed.
Yes, again, thank you for having us, Anthony, and the continued interest in the following the Manito Trail Project. My interest really in this project began years ago, right after I got married, and I went to meet my wife's family in Riverton, Wyoming. And it was there where I discovered that there was a whole community of people whose families had originated in New Mexico. What was interesting about that for me was that they still carried on with Nuevo Mexicano traditions, the language, the foods, the spirituality, the religious traditions, etc. It was just like if I was in northern New Mexico, but so far away from home. And I found that very compelling, very interesting. How did those people survive, or how did their culture survive so far removed from their native homeland, being the Manito homeland in northern New Mexico? And as the years went by, in my visits through Wyoming, Colorado, other places, contemplating my own family's migration, my aunts and uncles to California, my grandfather, who was a sheep herder in Monte Vista, Colorado, where he passed away on a sheep ranch there. I just began to really consider the Manito Trail as an area of interest, and so that's really where it began. What I'm interested also now, and Trisha and I are working on this summer, is not only the migration outward, but the migration back inward, people who have left and are coming back. You mentioned earlier that there is a low population, I guess, of people moving to New Mexico. I think that's what you were saying.
Well, we had the census data, Levi, that shows that New Mexico was one of the slowest growing states in the West. It was only behind Wyoming in population growth over the last decade. That's according to census data released this year. So it makes me wonder, how can this project really play a role in capturing so many of those stories, especially when we hear about people leaving the state so much to seek opportunity, Levi?
Yeah, I find that interesting because in the village where I'm from, Dixon, originally El Puesto del Embudo de San Antonio, And in most villages throughout New Mexico, I'm sure that Trisha can attest to this too as well, where she's from, that very few Nuevo Mexicanos are coming back at the rate that non-Nuevo Mexicanos are moving in. So there's a rural gentrification going on there. And so it's interesting that the state might have those statistics, but where are the stories? And that's what this project is about, really is about the stories themselves.
Yeah, Trisha, I want to hear more about this from you. You serve as a research scholar with the project. What made you interested in wanting to be a part of it?
Hi, everyone. I am a product of the Manito Trail. My family is from northern New Mexico, Valdez, Taos area, as well as the Sapeo Mora areas. And they migrated up to Wyoming for employment. My great-great-grandfather was a sheep herder up in Hanna, Wyoming. And I was born up there. So I was really excited to hear about the project when I was at the University of New Mexico. I met Levi. He told me a story. I was so excited to join the project team. And to my surprise, the very first interview I went to transcribe was the voice of my grandmother. Levi had taken a group of students up to Wyoming to interview a group of New Mexicans that were living up there. And so I was listening to the interviews to transcribe them, and it was the voice of my grandmother, and she was telling all of our family business, and it was exciting. It was fascinating. I loved just being connected to the project from the very beginning.
So what do you have in store for this project in the coming future, Trisha, as working as a research scholar? What are you focusing on right now?
Well, I'm continuing to collect and gather stories of migration, not only to Wyoming. My area of research was focused on migration to Wyoming because of my own ties, but I've started to gather stories from other places as well, California, Utah, places they went for to serve in the Army and for employment and family and marriage reasons. I'm currently working on building a database for the Manito Community Memory Project that will provide visualization for this migration experience. And as part of the Following the Manito Trail Project team, we're actually working together this summer into the fall to put together Following the Manito Trail Exhibit Part 2 that will be hosted at the Taos Millicent Rogers Museum early spring of next year. And then hopefully it's going to transfer up to the University of Wyoming, the American Heritage Center for a visit up there.
Wow. Patricia, you just joined the project as a research scholar. What brought you to the project? What are you interested about this project, and what attracted you to it?
Well, like Trisha, I'm a product of the Manito Trail as well, just not to Wyoming, but to Texas. So my family's from Delia, New Mexico, which they're actually also from Anton Chico, Milagro, like all these places that are in the Llano Estacado between Santa Rosa and Las Vegas. So I actually grew up in the Texas Panhandle in a small little community just south of Amarillo. And I grew up with my grandparents who were constantly telling these stories about New Mexico. A lot of my family left New Mexico to either go to California during World War II. They also went to Pueblo, Colorado, and stayed there to work. I think there's steel mills or something up in Pueblo. We had been sheep herders here in Delia for a long time. And then my grandparents, after going to California and a little stint back in Albuquerque, ended up in a small town just on the other side of Clovis called Friona, Texas, where they did cotton fields for a little bit, meat packing. But I grew up with all these stories of New Mexico, all these place names. And in Texas, you know, that stands out, especially in the Panhandle. There's not a lot of places like that. So
okay, let's jump into that a little bit. Why
okay.
is that? Why does that stand out so much?
Well, like I said, in that part of the Panhandle, it's really about Anglo-Americans for the most part, like Mexican Americans, Nuevo Mexicanos, what we call manitos. We just really didn't have a voice there. So when I would go to my grandparents' house in Friona, it was this refuge where the language was there, the food was there, all these stories were there, and it was the only place I saw my story ever growing up. That was it, was in my grandma and grandpa's house. So, you know, we'd tell these stories, or they would tell these stories about growing up on the llano, about, you know, these different little restaurants and bars that our family owned. And I would just sit there and listen, because I was like, this is impossible that we can have places named after us. I mean, in Texas, I'm always, and my cousins, we're always the only Pereas around. And then when I'd come to New Mexico, I'm like, wow, there's so many Pereas here. Nobody can pronounce our name. But here, it's like the name of restaurants. So it was like, it was eyes open. I was so happy whenever we'd come here for family reunions, because it felt like I was finally home. I always, you know, I write. And so one of the things I've written about my grandpa a lot, who died in 2004, was, you know, I thought for him, Texas was kind of a purgatory. All he ever wanted to do was come back to Delia, to Anton Chico, to that beautiful, beautiful llano that just, you know, when you come off of Las Vegas, there's those plains that stretch out before you. And we are some of that family. Me, my dad, and my uncle have all come back to New Mexico. I came back to Albuquerque, and my dad and my uncle went back to Vado.
So, Patricia, how does that affect you growing up when you only have your grandmother's house where you can find refuge, and then you walk outside the door and it's a completely different world where it may be confusing to you, or you're trying to find your sense of belonging? How has that affected you?
Well, it got me a PhD.
Okay.
Is how it affected me, because I had teachers in, there's a little town called Canyon, Texas. I had teachers who refused to believe the work I turned in was mine, who, when we had these stories about the Depression, you know, they'd make us tell these stories about the Depression. And I don't mind saying her name, Mrs. Bird. Or so we'd have these stories about the Depression. And my family, you know, living off of Route 66 in Santa Rosa, they didn't really have the same experience of those families living in the Dust Bowl in the Texas Panhandle or in Oklahoma. So my grandma would tell me these stories about people, you know, migrants coming from Oklahoma into California, and they'd stop, you know, around Delia, which is Santa Rosa really, and ask for food. And so we had this little like liquor package store or whatever that was right there, and they'd give it to them. So I tell my little report, and the teacher just told me, I'll never forget it. She was like, you're lying. There's no way Mexicans could be doing better than white people. And that put me on my road to a PhD. So that's how it affected me.
Okay. Vanessa, I want to talk with you a little bit about the project and really how far it's reached so far. What states have you been able to find stories from so far?
Well, we had, I think Levi and I started talking about this project in about 2016, 2017. And so I feel like we've gotten a lot accomplished since then. Levi often uses the dicho, payuta pa califas o palarmi, right? So that was really sort of, you know, our impetus for thinking about, well, where did Manitos go? And Armando Solorzano, who wrote a really amazing book on the Latino history of Utah, the first chapter of his book says that Manitos were the first Hispanic settlers in the state of Utah. And then, of course, the more research that we did, we found that sheep herders from New Mexico were going up to Wyoming as early as the mid-1800s, and they were providing a viable food source for a lot of gold rush workers who were then on their way to California. And the census record, those early census records show that there were numbers of, you know, single males from New Mexico who were going up to Wyoming to sheep herd. And so in 2016, Troy Lovata, who's a professor at the University of New Mexico, and Adam Herrera, who was our producer for the project for a while, we went to the Sierra Madre Mountains in Wyoming, and we were able to document different arbor glyphs, so carvings made by Manito sheep herders on aspen trees. And the earliest date that we found was 1906. And so they have been marking their presence on various landscapes for a long time. And so even in Wyoming, you see these sort of different markers of cultural New Mexico heritage, rather, throughout the state. And right now, you know, I'm looking at Arizona because there are lots of Manito communities from southwestern New Mexico that went to Arizona to work in the copper mines. So we came across this beautiful unpublished memoir as of now, so I won't mention her name, but she wrote about her family's migration from Frisco, New Mexico, near the San Francisco Mountains, over to Clifton Morenci, and how they sort of developed what Levi has now called a tale of two querencias, right? So how do you think about developing a home space away from home and really integrating those linguistic and cultural elements into these alternate spaces? And of course, we have a lot of work to do in Colorado, in California. Patricia is beginning to do really great work in Texas. And so really we're thinking about this as sort of a US West migration. But my sister went to Boston a couple of years ago on a fellowship at Harvard, and she tells a story of riding her bike 25 miles to get green chili, right? Because that for her was a culinary cultural marker of home, even though she was on the East Coast.
Yeah. I mean, we've heard a lot, I think, some similar stories when folks are out of the state and they run into other people from New Mexico or search for something associated with the culture. Levi, you have been working on this project as well, and also as somebody who teaches cultural studies, what are some things that you have found that people lose when they migrate out of New Mexico over the years? Can you kind of share that a little bit with us?
Yeah, I think that something that Patricia touched on is this sense of belonging, this sense of being present in the landscape, whether it's the cultural landscape or the social landscape, the political landscape. This idea of querencia, what we call querencia here in Nuevo Mexico, the idea of home and homeland. We are a land-based people from northern New Mexico. We are land-based people. And so when we migrate outside of that home environment, we wind up in another place that is foreign to us, where we don't have this sense of home in the way that we did back in northern New Mexico, where you step out the door and everything is foreign to you. You may not feel like you belong. But that's interesting that over time is what happened in Wyoming, for example, with the stories that we were able to document, is that it did become their homeland. Communities like in Riverton and Rawlins, Cheyenne, even where Trisha is from, even though they were so far from home, that's what is interesting about the story, is that they made it their homeland again. And so this connection to New Mexico continued to exist. And that's one of the questions I think that we're beginning to address now too, as well, is how does that carry on with the younger generations? Do they still have that sense of identity of being Nuevo Mexicanos, as being Manitos, or are they now so far removed that they no longer have that connection to the place of their parents or grandparents' upbringing? So that's something also that's we're going to be documenting to as well in the stories, especially in the stories of inward migration, of people coming back, and what was that like for them to be away from home all those years and then to come back. And as you know, the old cliche is you can never come back home again. You can never go home again. So can you actually come back home after having been gone for so many years? And how do their children feel about that too as well? Is it a tale of two querencias? Is it the querencia that their parents knew? Is it the querencia that they grew up knowing?
So speaking of the next generation that you brought up, Trisha, what are you finding out with your research on people, their concerns about being able to pass on tradition and culture to the next generation? Or what is the next generation saying to you, or what are you finding out with this project?
Great question. I've been blessed with a family that was able to keep intact our culture and our traditions because of the in and out migration patterns of going back and forth between New Mexico and Wyoming, and coming for the fiestas and coming to family events where the culture was rich here in New Mexico. So my family in Wyoming was able to sustain that. What I think is amazing is in both at the University of New Mexico and at the University of Wyoming, I've been teaching this material in my Chicano Studies, Latino Studies course curriculum. And I have students in both spaces that are able to find themselves. For example, in Wyoming, they're enrolling into these Latino Studies classes, and then they find themselves because they too had grandparents who migrated from New Mexico. And it's such a beautiful experience because they kind of felt like out of place, kind of just searching for their identity within the curriculum. And then we bring this Manito Trail information to them, and they are inspired. They go home, they tell stories. They're like, no wonder my dad always drives here to go get green chile. It's kind of similar to what Dr. Fonseca was sharing. And it's beautiful. They go home, they ask their grandparents for more information. They bring that to me and they're showing me these pictures. And I mean, something that would come out of my own family photo album. And so I think by us conducting this research and keeping the project alive in our community and in these spaces and in our classrooms, we're able to preserve our heritage in a very unique and beautiful way.
Well, Tricia, you mentioned that it was discrimination that kind of fueled your fire to achieve your PhD and academic success, but that might not be the case for a lot of folks. I mean, it's probably a pretty unique thing, and we're having this great debate right now in our country about how we're approaching the issue of diversity. And in some states, I mean, this is a very challenging issue, really across the country if you think about it. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what people need to consider when it comes to this issue, on what you've experienced, and what do you think gets lost with the migration when it comes to this?
Absolutely. So I'm the oldest in my family, oldest cousin, oldest grandkid, from the oldest son. So all of my cousins after me were actually born in Texas. They were born in Lubbock or El Paso. So one of the things that I've seen is my cousins struggle with this and not really know their New Mexican background. They know we have these New Mexican grandparents and this food that we grew up with, and this music and this, way of speaking, but they don't really know the history or the background at all. And, whether it's Lubbock or Amarillo, El Paso a little bit less so, but Lubbock or Amarillo, it's really, really hard to be, a Mexican or a Mexican American in those communities. So one of the things I think that we're doing to try to help this, and in Texas, it's really, really difficult. We have those ethnic studies classes that the Texas Board of Education is kind of always fighting with, very much like in Arizona. But one of the things that I think we're doing in the Manito Project is creating a website, a space where people can go and read stories, where people can go and tell stories. And even though, we're scholars and researchers, I think we're also storytellers. So when we gather, at these events, quinceañeras, weddings, baptisms, funerals, we always talk about, let's talk about these people who came before, our histories. So one of the things I did is, because I also work at the National Hispanic Cultural Center, is on Friday I was looking through baptismal records and I was finding all this family I had who are weavers, right? They were part of the WPA project in the 1930s. So I have a cousin from Vegas who's teaching me how to weave. And I'm like, yes, I can't wait to teach my younger cousins or even their kids this story, because it's so connected to sheep, it's connected to ways of living, it's connected to a piece of history. And even if they, went to college or not, they can hear the stories and they'll keep passing the stories down. And just hearing those stories, like it did for me as a younger person, is empowering. It's so empowering to know that we have a place where we belong, even if we're being raised in a place where we're constantly told we don't.
Wow. Vanessa, I'd like to hear from you. What are some stories that you've captured so far that really stand out to you?
Yeah, I think that you bring up a good question about the different types of discrimination that Manitos had faced historically. There were lots of different scenarios in Wyoming of folks we had interviewed who were denied housing simply because they were Mexican or Mexican American. Individuals in Concho and St. John's, Arizona, tell us stories of discrimination in terms of water and land rights. And it's interesting to talk about, sort of these identity politics with this, because there is a very big sort of Anglo-American, Hispano-Mexican, Mexican-American divide in many of these rural communities that where we're talking to folks. And, when you ask them what this all boils down to, they'll say, because we're Mexican, that's why we're treated this way. And so it's not even about, there are various attempts, of course, for individuals to try and figure out where their place is amidst this sort of political strife. And Patricia mentioned, the politics in Arizona. And of course, we all know, HB 2281 with the ethnic studies ban, and then more recently, national conversations around the elimination of critical race theory as a framework for us to discuss really marginalized contributions to, the United States, more generally speaking, but discrimination really is at the key of a lot of these conversations. And so again, like Patricia said, how do we create and defend our sort of sense of place and sort of that idea of an extended Manito homeland amidst all of this sort of political strife? And I think that's something that we've seen historically, but we're also seeing today.
So I'd like to hear, what do you expect for the future then, Vanessa, with this project? What are your goals? We only have about a minute left too, I'm sorry.
Yes. So I'm excited about this Whitting Foundation public engagement grant. It really funnels nicely into the Manito Trail Project, but it also allows communities to take part in the storytelling process, right? How do we amplify the voices, and how do we really think about, as scholars, who work in the university, how do we think more critically and carefully about engaging with community as co-producers of knowledge? And how do we uplift their voices to then create that sort of counter narrative to those more sort of Anglo-dominated histories and stories of the regions that we're looking at?
So how can folks find out about the project?
Yes, so you can go to manitotrail.com. We also have a Facebook page. We have a growing Instagram and Twitter page, but Facebook is really where we engage the most. And so feel free to find us following the Manito Trail on Facebook or manitotrail.com, where our website is located.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining us. Dr. Vanessa Fonseca Chavez, Levi Romero, Dr. Trisha Martinez, and Dr. Patricia Perea. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about the Manito Trail.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we want to thank you for joining us for another episode of Fronteras, Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.